Welcome back to our Cael language series. Today we'll continue working on our speaking skills. This will be the 7th practice episode we've done in this series, and today we're going to focus on a new question on the Cael test. This one is still in part 1. It's an independent speaking task, but it's speaking on a visual. Now, as we always begin, we'll review the checklist of skills that you're going to want to demonstrate on the test when you record your responses. This is how the raters will assess your skills and give you a score. If you are already familiar with this checklist, please feel free to skip ahead about 5 minutes or so in this video. But we'll do a quick recap now so you'll know which skills to practice as you're working from home. The very first thing the raters will assess is your delivery skills. So we need to think of the basics that we'll cover in order for the listener to fully understand our voices. So the pronunciation needs to be clear. We should be speaking at an appropriate volume and speed so everybody can hear very clearly what it is we have to say. Once those basics are covered, we then look at the rhythm and the intonation that we use with our voice, as these elements will certainly help to clarify meaning as you're speaking. A real challenge to practice at home is speaking with confidence from beginning to end of the response with minimal pausing and very few interjections. It's natural to a point to pause once in a while if you're thinking of the next idea, and quite often we'll make little interjections. We'll say or very once in a while as we're speaking. Again, that's normal to a point. What we want to avoid doing, though, is interrupting the flow of our speech too often. So try your best to cut down on the number of pauses and on the number of interjections as you're speaking. After your delivery skills are fully assessed, the raters are going to focus in on your use of language. So the vocabulary words that we choose in our Cael responses should be very precise and specific. They need to be academic. So we're thinking of high-level skills here. Hopefully you've got a nice, widely developed range of words as well, because we don't want to just repeat the same words over and over. It's important to demonstrate a nice variety as well. Now, the connecting words that we use between ideas are also really important here. So think of your transitions and think of your conjunctions. The more variety that you can demonstrate in your sentence structure, the better your score will be in this area as well. And as this is an academic test, we're really focused on creating complex sentences and perhaps some compound sentences and so on. So again, a nice variety will impress the raters here. Always speak in complete sentences, please, as this is an academic test. Now, the content, of course, is really important. We need to have a focus presented right at the beginning of the answer that introduces what the main idea is. The rest of the response will be spent developing your ideas with supporting details and specific examples as well. Hopefully, you've got enough information to speak until the end of your answer without repeating yourself. We don't want to just repeat the same ideas over and over again throughout this response. Again, we're looking at having a very organized answer from beginning and then the middle details, and hopefully a concluding statement right at the end. A conclusion will often summarize the main point you were talking about, and it might even make a next step prediction, depending on what the question itself is asking you. Please make sure that everything you talk about answers the question at hand. There might even be a couple of questions or parts to the question as well as on the test, so make sure again that your details will answer those. Your tone is important. Again, remember, it's an academic test, so we want to avoid using slang expressions and overly casual language here. We want to create an academic tone while we're speaking. The raters will look at task fulfillment. So this encompasses 2 different parts. First off, the time is important. If you're asked to speak for 2 minutes, we need to get close to 2 minutes in order to fulfill this part of the raters checklist. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. If we finish in 1 minute and 52 seconds, but we've answered the question very completely, then it won't be a problem. All right, but aim to be close to that finishing time. Again, there often are 2 parts to these questions on the Cael test, so please make sure you're addressing all aspects of the question and that your answer is fully complete. that is how you'll maximize your score here as well. Now, for today's practice on speaking on a visual, there's one more element to this checklist that we need to add in here. Part of your score for this particular question is going to come from how accurately you're able to describe the graph or the chart that you're looking at on the test. You're going to be asked to work with the information to identify some general trends. So that also needs to be done very accurately using suitable language. And last but not least, you're also going to be asked to make some assumptions or draw some conclusions about the information. So all of these elements will also go towards assessing your score for this particular question on the Cael test. Let's look at a practice question now. You see this here on your screen before you. So you'll see what we mean when we say speaking on a visual. This looks like a line graph, and you're going to work with that information to answer. The very first thing I always encourage us to do when we begin a task is just to double check how much time we have to prepare and then how much time we'll be speaking. That will help you with some time management here on the test. Now, you are going to be given a full minute to look at this information and to get familiar with it, perhaps take some short notes. But you'll notice you're speaking for 2 full minutes. And in order to fill those 2 minutes effectively, you're going to need to make sure that you answer all parts to this question. So the instructions are beneath the visual, and they'll always be there on your screen. There are technically 3 different parts to this answer. You're going to describe, first of all, what you're looking at. You're then going to explain the information, and then you're going to make those conclusions or inferences about that info, and even predict perhaps what might happen next. If you can fit in each of these elements to your answer, you should be able to fit close to 2 minutes of talking time with relevant details. So I'd like to break that down now step by step so we have a better understanding of what's expected on this test. So as you're opening up your response when you start to record, of course, you're going to want to give an overview of what it is you're looking at so that the listener has a good sense of what you're talking about. You'll see the summary statement right at the top of the chart, and that information is going to match the title of the visual as well. So you see here on the screen, it says that this chart shows non-resident travelers to Canada. So you'd likely begin your recording with a statement that summarizes that point. Please do not read word for word from the test screen. Use your own words to explain what it is you're looking at. Again, that's going to help you with your vocabulary. So the very first thing that we're doing is describing. So once you've already introduced what this visual is all about, you'll want to work through the information. And if you follow the same order of details in each practice you do, I think you'll remember to do them all very effectively on the test. So you might want to consider starting with the axes of information. You'll notice down the vertical axis on the left-hand side, this tells us how many people are visiting Canada. So in your answer, you would just identify the information. You might say that the chart before me is depicting the number of people who visited Canada who don't actually live there. And we're looking at a population up to 5 million. So these are the types of details that you'll use to describe. You could get into some details here and talk about how that scale of the population actually increases by increments of 500,000 each time. When you look at the axes across the bottom of the graph, which is, I guess, straight across, horizontal, you'll notice that this gives a snapshot of a time frame. So this information is being given to us specifically from 2013 to 2016. So again, these are the details that you'll be including when you record your answer. You'll certainly want to talk about the legend, which here are the 3 ways that people are traveling into Canada. So we can see that we're looking at the number of people who flew to Canada, drove to Canada, or crossed the ocean by boat. So once you've given a very nice overview and described what it is we're looking at, that will probably take about 40 seconds, I'm going to estimate. You want to move on to the second step. You're going to want to explain these trends. So it's nice to give, I think, an overview of the trend itself. You'll notice that all of these ways to travel are increasing. So once we start by stating that, you can then start looking at methods of travel that show a sharp increase or perhaps a decline. You can look at methods of travel that had stayed the same and so on. And I'll give you some specific examples of that in just a moment. After you've worked through and identified those trends in an organized fashion, and that will be the bulk of your answer, most of your time will be spent there, probably a good minute or so of your time. That leaves you with approximately 30 seconds or so to offer up your conclusions as you're talking. So again, looking here at our chart, it would make sense to work with the airplane travel. That is clearly by far the most popular method of travel. So you would want to start asking yourself, why is that? So offer up a reason to explain perhaps why airplane travel was so popular in this time frame. That's an example of a conclusion. So let's take these elements then, and let's use it this visual. I think this is a nice way to understand what we need to talk about, or one way to approach this question anyway. So during your prep time, remember you've got 60 seconds. You'll want to maybe write down some notes as you see here. Now remember, in 60 seconds, you likely won't have time to write out full lines and sentences like you see here. You'll want to keep your notes nice and short and brief. As long as you can make sense of them, that's what counts. For practice purposes right now, as we're looking at the ideas on the screen, we have taken care to explain a little more fully in note form so that all of our viewers can see the information before us here and we'll follow together. So again, you're opening as you're recording. You're going to explain what it is you're looking at. So as we said, the chart shows how visitors are traveling to Canada and how many people visited. You'll want to work in the time period and the methods of travel as we just discussed earlier. And then once you've described what you're looking at, you then start into the trends. This is the explanation part. So I think for this particular chart, a really nice way to introduce the idea is to explain that all three methods of transportation did show an increase in the 3 years depicted on the chart from 2013 to 2016. So do you see how I just took that little idea from the notes there and I turned it into a nice long complex academic sentence? That's what you're hoping to do anyway when you're recording. Detail 1 here, the very first detail mentioned, shows the largest increase. So we would identify travel by air as the largest increase. And perhaps as you're talking about that in your answer, maybe this is a really nice opportunity to start thinking about why that would be. So part of your answer might contain inferences such as, well, it would take a very long time to drive into Canada from the mainland United States. So perhaps more and more people are flying to Canada because it's simply the quickest way to travel there. So that might be one example anyways of an inference or a conclusion that you can draw. Other ideas might even include considering who would be traveling to Canada. If more and more people are flying, you might suggest, that would indicate that perhaps more and more international visitors are visiting Canada. You might also infer that since airplane travel is quite expensive, the cost of a ticket is very expensive, that the travelers who are coming to Canada clearly are able to afford the cost of that ticket and that vacation or that study program, or for whatever reason they're visiting at that time. You might even further that again to explain that perhaps the visitors coming to Canada then are coming from countries that are at least economically stable enough that they, again, would have the wealth or the means to afford that transportation. So these are several examples anyways of inferences or conclusions you would draw for why so many people are traveling to Canada, and then again, who they are, who they might be for that matter. Keep an eye on your time. You don't want to spend all of your time talking about just one detail. You do want to give a very complete answer. So the number of details you present is going to depend a little bit on what the timer clock says on the test. You have 2 minutes. You need to complete your explanation and offers other conclusions as well. So the second detail listed here in this sample note talks about some similarities. So we notice here looking at the chart that travel by airplane and by land both dipped slightly in the year 2014. And once you identify that, again, this is a really nice opportunity to offer up a conclusion. So why might that be? Why would fewer people be coming in this particular year compared to the other years on the chart? So you would want to consider, were there things happening in the real world at that time? Were there political upheavals? Were there government decisions that restricted travel? Maybe there was an increase in terrorism globally and people were just too afraid to travel at that particular time. So again, come up with something logical that could make sense based on your own knowledge. It's really up to you which direction you want to take your conclusions in. As long as they're logical, that's what's important here. Okay, so you might explain a couple of conclusions there. There's a third detail listed here in the chart, and you would want to mention that travel by boat, so crossing the ocean, remained fairly steady. It maybe increased ever so slightly, but the number was fairly consistent in comparison anyways to the other two methods of travel. So I think if you could at least acknowledge each of those three methods of travel, you're fine with your time. Now, if you've given lots of conclusions about those other two details, you probably don't have much time to dwell on detail 3. So let's just move on to the conclusion. You might summarize your entire answer by suggesting, well, more and more people appear to be visiting Canada according to the statistics here in the chart. And then you might again come up with one reason why that could be, what makes Canada such an appealing country that people would want to travel here. And it would be really nice to finish off this entire answer by offering up a solid prediction about what could happen next. So extrapolate beyond the end of this chart. So beyond 2016, will people continue to visit Canada in increasing numbers? And I would say probably yes, that all indications seem to be that way, given what we're looking at on the chart. That's a very nice way to finish off. Okay, and again, this is only one approach. There are many other things you could say about this chart, but I'm demonstrating, I guess, some of the more common ideas, I guess, that we would come up with based on what we're looking at here. So what I'd like to do next is I'm going to play for you a sample response. This was actually given by a test taker on a past Cael test who actually answered this question. And I'd like to play her response twice. We're going to analyze the strengths and the weaknesses to see how effectively she answered this question that we just finished discussing. Now, the first time we hear this response, I'd like us just to focus in on her speech delivery. Remember, that was that first category on the rater's checklist. So we want to identify whether her pronunciation and her rhythm and intonation are clear, if we can follow her response without interruption and so on. All right, we'll discuss those strengths and weaknesses after we've listened. And it's helpful, I think, for us to actually look at the graph while she's talking so you can assess as well the accuracy of her ideas. All right, so let's listen in this first time and see how she does.
For us depicts the number of non-resident travelers to Canada between the years of 2013 to 2016 by traveling by land, sea, and air. The number of non-resident travelers to Canada is measured and starts from 0, goes to 500,000, and increases in increments of 500,000 up to 5 million. We can see that air travel is the most popular method, then land, then sea. However, between the years of 2013 and 2014, the number of non-resident travelers to Canada who came by air and land were on the decline. What we can conclude from this is that between those years, travel to Canada was a little less popular and so did not draw as many tourists or other non-resident travelers. After that, however, travel by land and air increases from the years 2014 to 2016. This, we can conclude, means that travel to Canada by any means was on the increase, more popular and more desired, with even a greater increase between 2014 and 2015 than there is between 2015 and 2016 by air. Sea travel is generally, on the whole, very steady and not increasing by much any year on this graph. And so what we can conclude is that people prefer to go by land or by air if they are traveling to Canada.
Okay, so that's the end of her answer. I'll let you know, by the way, it was 1 minute and 53 seconds, which is pretty close to the 2 minutes she was asked to fill. So that would be fine. The raters will be happy with that, and it won't penalize the score. It was very close to the end. I'll just start off our discussions here. I'm hoping that you're on board with the idea that her pronunciation and rhythm are very natural, very strong. So her speech delivery skills overall are very effective. She's confident and she's able to get from the beginning to the end of that answer with few pauses. There were a handful of pauses and some slowdowns as she was trying to think of a way to get to the next part of her answer. And I think to a point, maybe that's natural for most of us on the spot in a testing situation like that. So as much as we might notice a few pauses, they weren't overly distracting, and we were still able to follow her along right until the end of the answer. So overall, speech delivery was quite strong there for sure. I'd like to play the answer one final time, and this time we're going to follow along with the transcript, just so we can see the words as well, to fully understand, I guess, the vocab and the content ideas. Now, on the real test, the raters are not going to have a transcript of your answer. They're simply going to listen to your recording, and that's where your score will come from. But again, for practicing today, it's just easiest if we can see the transcript too. So that's what we'll do. So as you're listening this time, can you really focus in, please, on her use of vocabulary? We're looking not just for the vocabulary words, but also for her transitions and connecting ideas, connecting words. And we'll also try to follow along with the way that she structured this answer and the content. Okay, let's listen one final time here.
The chart before us depicts the number of non-resident travelers to Canada between the years of 2013 to 2016 by traveling by land, sea, and air. The number of non-resident travelers to Canada is measured and starts from 0, goes to 500,000, and increases in increments of 500,000 up to 5 million. We can see that air travel is the most popular method, then land, then sea. However, between the years of 2013 and 2014, the number of non-resident travelers to Canada who came by air and land were on the decline. What we can conclude from this is that between those years, travel to Canada was a little less popular, and so did not draw as many tourists or other non-resident travelers. After that, however, travel by land and air increases from the years 2014 to 2016. This, we can conclude, means that travel to Canada by any means was on the increase, more popular and more desired, with even a greater increase between 2014 and 2015 than there is between 2015 and 2016 by air. Sea travel is generally, on the whole, very steady and not increasing by much any year on this graph. And so what we can conclude is that people prefer to go by land or by air if they are traveling to Canada.
Okay, so there it is a second time through with the transcript. Let's start with her connecting ideas, the transitions and conjunctions, just to get a sense of sentence structure and things like that. So the red phrases we're looking at right now demonstrate how she is smoothly connecting ideas together within her response. These phrases are very effective, and they do demonstrate academic language. So words like however, and we can conclude, that's all well and fine. The only slight issue with it, though, is the repetitive nature of these phrases. So she's pretty much exclusively used those two words, either however or conclude. So what we would like to do when you're practicing at home, try your very best to vary the language that you're using so that you just have a little bit less repetition. That would be one comment to make here as a way to improve this answer. But it's still grammatically, it works, makes sense. The individual vocabulary words as well, for the most part, are quite precise. So we've got blue expressions here demonstrate this. So we can see increases in increments of, and on the decline, did not draw, very steady. So these are suitable words to use when you are describing a graph or a chart of this nature. You will see, though, that she does again repeat herself quite a bit with that word increases. She's used it 4 times anyways within this answer. So when you're practicing at home, try your very best to understand and even memorize a list of words that indicate when things are increasing or decreasing or staying the same. Try to make the words as academic as possible. So we might say things like it increases sharply, or it fluctuates, or it remains consistent, or it plateaus, and so on. So learn these directional words And you'll have them, I'm hoping, in your memory so that when you're faced with any visual, you'll be able to apply the correct word to the situation. Having those words in mind going into this test is going to help you avoid repeating vocabulary words, just like she has done here as well. The vocab could be improved a wee bit. The content, though, I think is organized quite well and fully answers the question. So at the very opening of her response here, you can see that she gives that global overview that we were talking about earlier when we were looking at our preparation time together. So she tells us exactly what the chart is explaining. She gives the years, she gives the population scale, as well as the legend, which is the 3 methods of travel. All of those things we talked about earlier too. All right, the middle part of this answer, again, gives lots of very specific details about the chart. All the information she discusses there is quite accurate. She's able to give, also identify some general trends here, as well as to offer up a couple of conclusions there as well. Her last sentence of this answer, her conclusion itself, finishes off by summarizing general trends, talking about people coming into Canada. So overall, the organization here works. So she's given a complete answer. The time as well, we've already mentioned, was done quite well, almost exactly 2 minutes. She was short by 7 seconds, which will not penalize her score. So the task fulfillment area then of the rater's checklist is done here quite well as well. I will let you know that this particular speaker earned a band 80 on her Cael speaking test. So if you know much about the scores, we've talked about it before, a band 70 is usually about the average score that a lot of schools or employers would require from the test taker in order to gain admittance to that program. So this test taker is able to demonstrate average to above average skills as well. Okay, and again, we don't know for sure if this particular response is a band 80. What we do know is the average of all of the speaker's scores average out together equal to band 80. So in summary, this is a very strong example of a high-level speaker on the Cael test. So let's just review quickly the strategies that we used as we're approaching this question that asks us to speak on a visual. You will be given that full minute to prepare. So this is where you're going to want to look at the diagram or the visual, take some quick notes to identify all of those important elements that we were just talking about. So look at the summary statement, look at the 2 axes on the chart if there are some, look at the other factors as well listed there. And when it comes time to speak, you're going to give a summary of those important points. So if you could write down just a few keywords even on your notes, that would be very helpful for you. Once you've described what you're looking at, you're then going to start explaining those trends. So this is where you really focus in on each part of the visual itself. So identify elements that have increased, decreased, or stayed the same. Look at comparing different aspects as well. So did something increase while another one decreased perhaps, and that sort of thing. And as you're speaking, feel free to offer your own conclusions about why that information is presented. The more academic or specific vocabulary that you can use here, specialized for graphs, the better you'll maximize your score anyway under that vocabulary area of the checklist. So here are a few examples on your screen of academic language that could apply to a visual. So words like stabilize, fluctuation, marginal, and so on. So these would be more interesting than just saying increase over and over again, right? So you want to make sure that you're learning these words and applying them effectively as well. And you would finish your entire response with a conclusion, right? Summarize the main point and offer even a prediction of what could happen next. That's always an effective way to finish off a question like this. All right, so I'm hoping you've got some more ideas now about how you might continue to practice for this question at home if you're studying for an upcoming Cael test. Next week, join me again and we will continue to practice our speaking skills. See you then.